Welcome everyone to the Immigration Policy Lab's technical demo webinar on low-cost automated WhatsApp surveys. We're so excited that you're joining us today and we're really much looking forward to today's content. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the work of the Immigration Policy Lab is primarily conducted on the traditional territory of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. We thought it would be helpful to situate us in a broader timeline of webinars and the different materials that we've been releasing to accompany the WhatsApp survey method. So last week on October 21st, we had our first webinar, which was an introductory webinar on the motivations and context for the development of this WhatsApp survey method, as well as case studies told to us by our partners implementing these surveys in the field in 2 different contexts. So if you missed that webinar, please feel free to watch the recording, which is available on our website. We also, shortly after that webinar, we released several different types of material to accompany and hopefully assist other practitioners and researchers who are interested in applying this method themselves. So there is step-by-step documentation with screenshots and a lot more fine-grained detail on how to implement this, as well as code, a repository of code on GitHub for your use as well, and YouTube videos and things like that for your use. So those are also available now on the IPL website. Please visit our website to check those out. At this point, I would love to call out that URL. It's immigrationlab.org/WhatsApp surveys. We will refer to the resources that we offer throughout this webinar today as well. So please note this URL and use it throughout your journey of using WhatsApp surveys. I thought I would also orient us in terms of today's agenda and what we plan to cover today. After a short introduction, we'll spend the bulk of today going over a technical demo live with a lot of details on key concepts that you may encounter, the system overview of the different platforms that we use, how they link together and how they work together in action, and of course, privacy and security considerations at the end of that. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box that Zoom provides in this webinar so that we can keep track of them. We will take questions throughout the demo rather. So please send those in. We'll be monitoring those actively, and then we'll pause for questions a couple times throughout. And then at the end, we'll talk through next steps and of course review the resources that are available at your disposal. So let's begin by introducing IPL and the team. The Immigration Policy Lab is a global hub for immigration policy research. We're focused on the policies and programs that support the integration of refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants worldwide. We have branches at Stanford University and ETH Zurich. We specialize in rigorous evaluations, partnership-based work, and creating an experiential model for training scholars and researchers and fostering a global community of researchers and practitioners in the immigration policy space. I'm joined today with 2 colleagues who will be co-presenting with me. My name is Jennifer Fay. I am I'm a program manager at the Immigration Policy Lab. And I'm joined with Hannah Ingham, who is a senior software engineer at Slalom, as well as Jessica Wolf, who is also a program manager at the Immigration Policy Lab. This was also a huge team effort on the part of other people at IPL, as well as our partners. So we're very grateful to them and very excited to showcase the broader team effort through these webinars and the materials that we're offering. We're talking a lot about the method today and how to use it in practice, as well as the technical components. It's also exciting to mention, as we offer the method out to the public, that we at IPL are also testing this actively and implementing in the field in 2 distinct contexts, with resettled refugees in the United States, as well as Venezuelan refugees in Colombia. So you can learn more about those case studies in that first webinar recording, as I mentioned, or we'll also be releasing a working paper that details the case study setup, the research design, as well as the results from both of these, preliminary results from both of these case studies. So please look forward to that material, and we look forward to continuing to learn about this method as we apply and share with the community. So at this point, I would love to turn it over to the technical demo, which we'll spend most of today on, which is really showcasing of the different features and linkages of the platforms in action. And I'll pass it over to Hannah, who will lead us through that. Thank you so much, Hannah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah. As Jen mentioned, I'm from Slalom Build, and we worked really closely over the last 5-6 months with IPL as part of a hack for social good at our company, which was a hackathon. And if you're not familiar with that term, it's a project that developers work on together, usually on a volunteer basis, to develop some new type of technology or stand up a system that works with existing types of technology. So that's what we've been working really hard on. I wanted to start today just by offering a quick survey to our attendees. And there's 2 questions. One, I just want to gauge kind of on a scale of 0 to 5, what's your experience working with code? And then same thing on a scale of 0 to 5, do you have any experience working with APIs? So if you want to just take a second and answer both those questions on our quick poll. So it looks like we have a lot of different types of experience in our audience. That's what I would expect. I wanted to start with this just because I want to say that this workshop is really for everyone. So if you've never touched code before, that's fantastic. And if you don't know what an API is, that's also great. The goal of this is to really give everybody the confidence at the end of this demo to start to think about putting together this system themselves, especially with the support of our additional documentation. If you're somebody who has more familiarity with this, maybe you can jump in a little bit faster, maybe you can do a little bit more configuration. And so we just are really excited that you're here and can't wait to share this process with you. So one thing I want to start with before we dive into the demo is just taking a big step back and talking a little bit about the way the internet works for everyone who isn't super familiar with this process. We're going to be talking about the request response cycle. I'm going to use the metaphor of a restaurant to talk about this. So think back to 7 months ago when we used to go to restaurants, and there's 3 kind of main players here. So the employee, the person who takes your order, is going to be sort of the computer network. Then we have the kitchen, which does a lot of work in our restaurant to actually prepare things. And then the customer, which is like a client. This could be an application, or it could just be you sitting in front of your computer typing in a URL. So your typical ordering experience, you choose an item from the menu, you place the order or the request with the employee. That employee delivers the request to the kitchen. So this is like our network traffic, actually sort of delivering that request to the server. The server fulfills the request, so it has to do a lot of work. It's sort of the powerhouse of this whole system. And eventually the employee is able to respond with the item prepared for you, and then you can engage with that item by eating it and enjoying it. I like this restaurant metaphor because I think it expands out to talk about a little bit more of the complexities of our request response cycle. One thing is you kind of have to ask for something on the menu. Maybe if you ask for something extra, they'll be able to provide it, but mostly you're expected to work with that sort of static list, that static interface. Sometimes you have to be prepared to provide authentication. For example, if you order a glass of wine, they're going to ask for an ID of some sort, and they're going to check 2 things. One, that you are who you say you are, so looking at your photo, and then 2, they're going to authorize you. So basically they're looking, are you old enough to do this? This comes up a lot when we're making requests over the internet, and we'll see that today. You have to understand that mistakes happen sometimes. So maybe you misread the item and ordered the wrong thing. Potentially the employee could have forgotten to put the request in with the kitchen, so something was dropped. Or maybe the kitchen made a mistake when they're preparing things. So this is just something we have to be aware of when we're working with different technologies, and be prepared to investigate errors or just resend a request. And then also this is a cycle, right? So you're continuing to engage with the kitchen throughout the night via the employee that's networking and managing that traffic, which is what we would expect with the internet as well. I also want to define an API before we get started. That stands for Application Programming Interface. It allows applications to communicate with each other. And you can also think of it as just allowing users to make requests of an application. So maybe they want to get data, maybe they want to create a login with a new website. So that would all be, they would interact with the API. You can kind of think of a menu as a customer interface, a static interface. So an example of a valid request, going back to our restaurant metaphor, would be you walk into a pizza shop, you order a pizza slice, and you receive that pizza slice. So that's a success. You got what you wanted. However, let's say we walked into that same pizza shop, and this time we ordered ice cream. So the pizza shop doesn't offer ice cream. They're going to give you some sort of error, say that it's not there. On a network, this might be a not found error, right? That URL doesn't exist or something like that. When we talk about APIs, we talk about some really common request methods that they honor. One is a GET or a read request. So there's more specific information about exactly what you want to get. But in general, this is when you just want to get some information. There's also post or create. This is when you want to create something. So I mentioned a login before. Maybe you want to create a login credentials with some website. Now this requires that you actually pass in information to the request, unlike GET, where you just ask for information. These two we'll be using today as we set up our system. There's two more I just wanted to highlight, put, update, and delete, but those aren't things that are going to come into play today. So I want to jump right into our system design, and there's a lot of pieces to this flow. So I'm going to walk through step by step how we'll build this out, and then we'll see how it all connects together. The first thing we're going to look at is the Twilio console. So we'll be in the Twilio dashboard, and we'll be building out the Twilio flow. We've prepared a demo flow today, which is just short and sweet to highlight some of the key points. We'll then go to the Google platform, and we'll look at a Google contact sheet. This is going to just store numbers and some of the details about the flow. There's going to be a Google script connected to this, and this is cloned from a template that we provide in the documentation and includes the Google script. So we'll talk a little bit about what a Google script is and then how it actually enables us to interact with the Twilio API. Once we have these two pieces set up, we'll test that these two things are wired in before we move forward. After we've tested that, we'll go back to Google Sheets and we'll just look at the Google Sheet that will eventually hold our responses. This will provide us a Google Sheet ID that we can use when we then go to set up our Twilio function. So our Twilio function, that's going to exist of code. A function is simply just a block of code. So we'll be referring to that concept quite a few times tonight, or this morning, excuse me. And then the last part will just be to integrate the function with the Twilio flow. And then we'll just do one more test here to hopefully see it all flow through and see our system at work. So with that, I'm going to switch my screen share so that I'm just sharing my browser. So right now I'm on the Twilio console dashboard, and I'm looking at all of the flows that I've already set up. And flow is a word that Twilio uses to describe the design or designing the survey. So what you are getting today before this webinar started. I'm going to select to create a new flow, and I'll call it my demo flow. I'm going to be starting it from scratch today. There are some other pre-built out flows, but we'll do that today. So you can see I'm really just looking at a blank screen here. If I were building this out from scratch, I would start to select different widgets from this side window and drag those on. Today, I have a pre-built flow, and I'll show you how you can use a pre-built flow to actually populate this in the Twilio UI. So I've navigated to the public GitHub repository for the rapid response survey. We have quite a few resources in this that you can use when building this out. I'm going to go into Twilio resources, and I'll be selecting this webinar demo flow. I'm going to click on raw. This just gives me a really easy way to capture everything in this file. This file is a JSON file. It stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Essentially, it's just one large object, which is something that exists between two curly brackets. The other important thing about an object is it has two parts to it. It's filled with keys and values. So keys are here on the left side, values on the right side. We'll refer back to that concept of key value pairs a couple times in this demo, but that's really what we're looking at here. Now, Twilio uses this to store their flows. So I can actually upload this JSON file that I've just copied and give it a few moments, and it will populate a flow for me. Since that JSON file stores information about the widgets and even where the widgets are placed on the UI. So you can ensure that you're getting an exact copy of that.
Hi, Hannah. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Would you mind zooming into your screen just a bit more?
Not at all.
Thank you.
All right, so we've had this set up. First of all, I'm just going to save this. Every time you make a change to your flow, you want to make sure to publish that out. That is essentially just saving it on the Twilio servers. And you can see this is similar to what you took this morning if you did participate in that survey. So hello, thank you for registering. And then after you reply to this, there's this logic block that splits. So depending on the participant's response, you can route them to a different question, or if they don't want to participate, route them to an exit survey. There's a lot you can do with these flows. We'll touch on this a little bit more at the end of the presentation. I also want to say Twilio has some great documentation about building these out. And then in addition, our documentation also details a little bit more about how to build these out. Okay, so for now, I think I'm good with my flows. I'm going to just navigate back to this home screen. And then we'll look at the contact sheet. So I already have this pulled up here. And I think I mentioned that we have a template contact sheet that you can clone. I've already done that in this case, but that will give you the same headers that you'll need on this one sheet. Now, the interesting part of this contact sheet is the script that's attached to it. So I'll go ahead and go into that. You can navigate to your Google Scripts by going Tools and then Script Editor, and then you'll see that script pop up. If you're not familiar with this idea of Google Scripts, I just want to point out that there is a dashboard where you can see all of your script projects, so to speak. Each script is associated with a container, and a container is what you're probably more familiar with, which is a Google Sheet or a Google Doc. So you can see this is the one we're looking at right now. We have demo contacts IPL, and that has this script. You can just get some more details about it if you look at the project details. There's more you can do with this dashboard just to sort of manage your different projects, and I'm just pointing it out here today if you're interested in learning more about that. So back to our script, I want to point out that there's a few settings or parts of this that you'll need to change to make it specific to your to your flow. So I'm actually going to just remove this logger line since we don't need it in this case. The first thing is you see these two variables that are set here, account ID and account token. These come from your Twilio accounts. And the way you set those is to go to File, Project Properties, and then you'll see over here there's this option for Script Properties. I'm not going to show those today, but this is the screen that you'll be looking at when you go to Script Properties. You want to make sure that you enter in two properties or key values, account ID and account token, exactly the way they appear on the script themselves. So make sure there's an exact string match between these two pieces. And then the values, these are you're going to get from your Twilio console. And just to point out where that would be, you would go to Settings and then click on Settings, and you would see those two values there. We store these in the project properties just so that they're a little bit less visible. The account ID is going to be something that is specific to your account. The account token is something that you really want to make sure you protect, you don't share with other folks. And if you do have any reason to believe that the security of this is compromised, I would recommend just regenerating one. They make that easy on the Twilio website. The other thing we need to update this in this script is the flow ID. And so since we just made a new flow, we can go ahead and do that now. excuse me, let me go back to my main page here. So this is the flow I just made. I'm just going to copy this, go back to my script, and then update this. So you can see that value is changed. The sheet name, since we have cloned this from the template, this is already set up for us. Executions. This is called executions because this is just a term that Twilio uses to describe an active survey with a participant. You can also see I have a from number here. So this is a number that's part of the Twilio account that's been registered with WhatsApp. So we can actually send messages to this number, and you can see that has this WhatsApp formatting in front of it. If we were just using a regular SMS number, we would remove that WhatsApp. And then you can see that this file goes on for a little while. I'm not going to touch on all of this. I do want to point out that we have a video that goes into a lot more detail about what's actually happening in this code. I do want to draw your attention to a couple pieces. So one is batch size. I've set that to 1 today since I'm only sending it to myself. But we wanted to set this up to support really large batches. So if you're sending out a survey to hundreds or thousands of participants, what we found is that when we sent all of those surveys out at once, there was some errors in terms of what Twilio could handle and also in terms of what the Google API could handle. So we've developed a way to send out smaller batches. So we recommend maybe 30 batches, and then you can do a 5-minute interval wait time. That gets set down here in this smaller function block of code that has a job to do. And so you would just update that to 5. Again, there's a lot of more detail about the batching in the documentation, so I would recommend checking that out. The other piece I want to draw your attention to is where we're setting this options idea. So you can see here we have variable options. This is where we're using our account set and account token. It's being set in the headers. And then down below, you can see that we're adding to this options object, and we're including some more information. So to and from. Now, this is all important for that request that we're going to put in. Remember, request is like we're placing an order with the employee at the restaurant. So first of all, we design the URL. The URL includes that flow ID. And then we place our order. The order has 2 parts to it. It has the URL, and it also has the options with the numbers and the credentials that we need. So this can go then over to Twilio, and Twilio can decide if it's able to actually initiate this survey. Okay, so I think we've made all of the changes we need to make here. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to go over here, and I think I've already saved this, but just to be sure, let's save it again. And then I'm going to try to actually test this part and send over my survey. So from here, I'm going to go Tools, Macros, Batch Survey. That script will run, and then we see that we get some information come back here. So this is information that we're getting back from the request that we're sending over to Twilio. So we just get some data about that. That helps us if we need to go into that execution and find out more execution-specific details. So I'm going to switch my screen share again here to my WhatsApp. And you can see that I have a message that came through. So I can say, maybe in this case, no, I'm not interested in actually engaging with the survey. And let's see, So it's actually prompting me, and this makes me confident that I have wired in these 2 pieces correctly, and that I am ready to move on to my next steps. So going back to the browser, we'll take a moment to just think about where we are. So we've done step 1 and we've done step 2, and then we've stopped and we've tested it and made sure that everything was integrated between these first 2 steps. I'm going to pause here and just see if there's any questions that we can answer before we move on to steps 3 and 4.
Thanks, Hannah. We have a question. When you use Twilio, can you edit the code itself as well, or are you always working with widgets?
So you certainly can, and what you would be editing is that JSON documentation. So you can manage your whole Twilio survey from the JSON if you want. And then they offer the widgets and that UI just for a slightly less technical version of keeping up with your, of editing your survey.
Perfect. And one other question, what does the batches column in the Google Sheets store?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't touch on that a lot just because we weren't talking about the batches, but if I did have several participants in this list, let's say I was doing batches of 10, after 10, we would just see a value here, next batch start, which would essentially signal to the function that this is where they're gonna pick up for the next time. So when you are completely done with your group, your participant group, this will just be totally empty, but while it's running, it needs an indicator just to let it know where it's left off and where it needs to start the next time. All right, so I think we're just gonna move ahead now. We're gonna be looking at the Google Sheet next. That will store the responses and then the Twilio function piece. So I've already set up a Google Sheet that will store our responses, and you can see it's very exciting. It's essentially blank. I just want to point this out because we're going to need something from this Google Sheet in order to set up our function. Specifically, we're going to need this unique identifier that can be found in the URL. This is what Google refers to as the sheet ID, and so we'll be copying this into our function once we're ready to do so. I'm ready to go back to Twilio though, and I'm going to scroll down to the very end of this function. You can see that, in fact, we already have a function here, but in order to show you how this gets set up, I'm going to delete this widget. And then I'm going to go and create a new one. So I'm going to click on Run Function. First thing I'm going to do is name this function, and I'm going to call it invoke demo function, because this is really what its job is. Invoke or start or ask a function to actually run. That's what this widget is going to be doing for us. And then I just want to run it in every case here. So I'll go ahead and do that. Okay, you can see I have this little exclamation mark, something's wrong. That's because I haven't selected a function URL. If I go to this dropdown, you can see all of the functions that are already in existence for this account. Today, we're going to create a new one just to demo that process. So when I go here, I'll just click on this plus sign again. And again, I'm going to be doing a blank function since I'm going to be using some code on the GitHub repository. First thing I'll do is just name my function. And I will also give it a path URL. And this is just the way that Twilio actually accesses the function to run it. So this is kind of the friendly name, and then this is really where the function is going to live and exist. Next thing is you'll see that there's this large code block here. Twilio's already put in some simple code for us, but we'll go ahead and actually replace this. So I'm going to go back to my GitHub. And again, this is the place where the code is stored. And in this case, I'm going to be looking at the post survey data handler, which is that sample handler. I'm going to use raw again. This just is an easy way to copy and paste. It also ensures that you don't get any unwanted formatting. With code, formatting can be very important. So sometimes when you copy and paste, symbols are slightly corrupted. So doing raw is a really good practice here. So let me go back to my function and then replace this with this code. Okay. Just like with the flow, we want to be saving this every time we make changes. You'll see these two windows pop up that your function is deploying. And again, that just means it's saving on the Twilio server. So when it goes to access that, it will get the most up-to-date version. So it looks like our function has successfully deployed. just like with the Google Scripts, there's a couple things that you're going to need to add into this code. And just like with the Google Scripts, you'll also notice that there are quite a few lines of code here. So just really quickly, the first piece is just defining some variables. We'll come back to that. You'll also see there's some smaller functions. Again, just a block of code that has a job to do. And these are what I would refer to as helper functions. They just are doing small pieces of logic. And then down below, really starting in line 138 is where the main Twilio handler lives. And handler is just sort of another name for function, just a common way that those are named. So this is what is actually going to be invoked when that run widget gets hit. And then this actually uses those helper functions to do some of its work. So if you have more questions on this, there is a video that walks through this particular code block in a lot more detail. So let's go through and just update the things we need to update for today. One is we need to make sure we have something called a client email. And this is just where you put the key name for that client email and then a sheet ID key name. Now, these two things are going to be in the configure section of this functions class. Configure, it's kind of like the project properties that we saw in Google Docs. So it's just a place where we can put IDs that we might not necessarily want to make super public. And first, let's look at the sheet ID. So so for sheet ID, we would just make sure that this value is correct. And so going back to my responses page here, I would just highlight this. And then I go back to my configure, and then I would just update this. And then once that's updated, again, I would hit save to actually save that detail. Now, notice that you might have multiple sheet IDs that you're managing if you have multiple contact sheets. So in that case, you would just want to rename sheet ID 2 and then change that string name in your demo function. So if I go back over to my demo function, I could update the string name to be sheet ID 2, for example. The next thing that we're going to talk about is this client email. And the client email comes from a Google project, which we haven't touched on yet. So let's go ahead and talk briefly about what that is. I'm going to navigate away from Twilio, and I have this bookmarked, the Google Developer Console. So this is where you're able to create new Google projects. And a Google project is something that you will need to have if you want to interact with the Google APIs. And so you'll create a new project and then you'll give it permissions to interact with specific Google APIs. Now, I've already done a Google project today, but we do talk more extensively about how to set up a Google project in the documentation. The one key piece I need from this Google project today is a service account. So a service account is going to allow me to grab an email address, essentially, of a service, so not a human user necessarily, but a machine that can then take action on different Google resources. So I've set up 2 service accounts here. If I didn't have any service accounts, I would go through the process of creating a service account, but I don't need to do that today. And then each service account is going to be associated with a key or some token values. And in order to generate that, you'll click on this and you'll do create key. And you'll want to use this JSON key type, which again is that object with string value pairs. And so if I were to create that today, I would click on create, I would see that download, and that would be something that I could open. When you download that and open it, you're going to get something that looks like this, depending on what application you use to open it. You'll notice that, again, we have these keys on the left-hand side and values on the right-hand side. The client email you can see is also included here, but it's also on that Google dashboard. And then the other thing that we'll be using from this is the private key. So this is going to be a really long key. And just to note, these /n marks, these are line breaks. So it's really kind of a block of characters that is offered as the key here. All right, so let's go and make sure that we have our email filled in correctly for the client email. So I already have that filled in, and it looks good to me, so we can navigate away from this sheet. So let's go back to my demo function, because this is the other piece that we'll need to update. If I scroll down to the handler level, you'll see that I have this space to actually put in that private key. Now, ideally, we would be able to store this in the config variables, but the configs have a really short character limit, and this is a really long string, so those don't fit with the UI constraints. However, our account is password protected, so we do have a protection around this key. If you do have a desire to not store this as part of the function, Twilio does offer a way to deploy functions from a local developer environment. So if you have experience with that, there's some resources on their website that describe how to do that. For our case, we wanted to make this approachable for somebody who wasn't a developer, who didn't have that environment. So that's why we suggested to put it into the function here. When you copy and paste that, just a note, you'll want to make sure there's a trailing comma here. If you do delete that comma, you'll get some errors from Twilio, so it'll help you know that there's some formatting that's not correct with your code. So just scroll to the end, make sure there's a comma there, and you should be good. So I would just save this here if I had that key, and my function would be ready to go. Let's go on to the next step, which is to really integrate the function with the Twilio survey. So just for this step, I'm going to share my whole desktop, and hopefully y'all will be able to see it. So let me just switch up sharing one more time. Let me share. All right. Okay, so we have our Google Sheets over here, and then let me go back to my actual flow here. Now that we've created this function, we would be able to see it in this drop-down menu, my demo function. Today I'm going to be using the configured demo function, which is something I set up before, and that's just because of that, that token that I didn't copy and paste in just for security reasons. So I can save that here. Now, the next step is to add in function parameters. Function parameters are going to be the input to our function, and what we want to provide it is all the information from the survey that the participant has responded with as they've been interacting with the survey. So for this function, apologize, I am going to zoom out a little bit, and I'll zoom back in. Note that we have question 0 up here. So a logical piece of data to store would be the user's answer to question 0. So I'm going to name the key question 0, and then over here, I'm going to do widgets.q0.inbound.body and select that. And then let's do Q2 as well. So that's another question we have. So Q2. Widgets.q. Actually, we have Q1 as well, so let's do Q1.inbound. And then if we scroll down, we'll have this option .body. I highly recommend using the Twilio dashboard support of autocomplete to help you fill in these widgets. You'll notice that B is capitalized on body. It's a very easy thing to miss and kind of a weird thing to debug. So if you use the autocomplete, then it will just help you avoid some of those errors. And then let's do, whoops, we need to edit this. This should be Q1. And then let's do Q2 as well. So this looks good. This should help us save the information that we get from the user. But we actually need to update our Google Sheet so that we have, that the Google Sheet is expecting those parameters as well. So what I mean by that is we need to add in headers up here, and they need to match the key values in our function parameters. So I did Q0, Q1, and Q2. Now I could make this any string. For example, I can make this banana. But if I do have a banana header up here, I want to make sure that I have a banana key value over here with a corresponding value. But I just want to point out that all that needs to match up is the string itself. These can be bolded, but caps are important, spaces are important. So we go into a little bit more detail on that in the documentation as well. Okay, so let's make sure that's saved. And then now that we have these function parameters set in, we have made changes to our flow. So we need to make sure that we publish that flow. All right. Now, one thing that's particular with the WhatsApp surveys is that you do need to associate a number with a flow ID. So we're going to do that now. You go into programmable messaging, messaging services, senders, WhatsApp senders, and then edit sender. And essentially, we're going to be editing the webhook URL, which is what Twilio is using to help it send the messages to the right place. And we're going to be editing the very end piece of this, which holds the flow ID. So apologies, I should have grabbed that flow ID before. We'll go back to our studio where we can grab the My Demo Flow ID. And then again, scroll to the end of this URL. Delete this, copy that flow ID. So we have an extra space in there, so I'm going to delete that, and then click out. Now, typically it should allow you to update the WhatsApp sender. So, okay, yeah, I think sometimes it doesn't, let me just double check that I have the right flow ID.
Anna, sorry to interrupt again. We actually did update that for you on the back end while you were speaking.
Oh, you did? Okay, that's fantastic.
But thanks for walking us through that.
Okay, thank you all. Yeah, so you should see that there's an option to update, great. Thank you all for helping me with that. Okay, so I can navigate away from this here. And now that I know that that's updated, we can, and we also can see that our flow is up to date, that we haven't made any changes. So we can try running this through and see what happens. So no pressure, just let's give this a try. So again, I'm going to be on this contact sheet. I'm just going to delete this previous execution, and then let's also be looking at our WhatsApp survey as we're going through this. So again, I'm going to do tools, macros. I'm going to do batch survey. I'm going to wait for it to show that the execution is started. And then I get this message over here. So let's say, yes, I want to interact with this survey. Maybe I'm interested in lower data collection costs. Maybe I have no questions at this time. And then I'll just respond with thanks for the survey. And you can see that the data has popped up here with my answers to those questions, which is exactly what I want to see. Now, I do want to say that if this doesn't work for you the first time, that is perfectly okay. That is really just the trial and error process of building this out. And what I would do is just double check all the steps that we've had before, make sure everything's saved, make sure your string values are exactly correct. And don't be hard on yourself. There's just a lot of pieces, as you can see from this demo. So that's just all part of the fun of building out these technical systems. Taking one last view of this diagram, let's look at what we just did. We built out the flow. We looked at the Google contact sheet that was already cloned for us from the template. We had to update a few values on the script so that it was associated with the right flow and had the right WhatsApp number. We tested that and we saw that the script was able to make a request to the Twilio API. The Twilio API granted that request by starting the flow. Then, since we already had the function in the Google Sheet set up, at the end of the flow, that's when we asked Twilio to actually run our function. We gave it the information it needed. So we gave it the response from question 0, question 1, and question 2. The function was responsible for actually interacting with the Google Sheets API. It gave Google Sheets API the credentials that it needed so that Google Sheets API could authenticate that request and then grant that request. And then that enabled the Twilio function to actually put those in the Google Sheet where those would be stored so that we could access those later. Let's go ahead and go back to our PowerPoint, and I'll let Jessica take over from here if you want to share.
Thanks, Hannah. We did have a question come in about storing phone numbers for the people you'd like to send the survey to. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, that actually is a perfect segue into our next slide, which is about security. So if we want to go to that, I can talk a little bit more about some of the details around storing information. So let me, perfect. Yeah, so the first part of it is HTTPS. We can go to the next section, so I can talk about phone numbers first if there's a question around that. So I'll just point out that all the data that you're storing on the Google Docs is stored on secure Google servers, but you'll want to make sure that your institution is comfortable storing that personally identifiable information. A couple of things that you can do just to protect that account is make sure that you have MFA set up on your Google account. So if you've ever signed into something and then in addition received a text message with a code, that's an example of multi-factor authentication, and it greatly increases the security. I'd also recommend making sure you have strict access limits to individual Google Docs so that you are aware of who has edit permissions, who has read permissions. Would recommend just double checking those. And then again, double checking with your institution. Another thing I'll touch on with security and privacy is an idea of HTTPS, which is the Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure. And this enables secure communication over computer networks. It uses encryption. And all of the endpoints that we're using today as part of those APIs, so all of the requests that we're putting in use HTTPS, so that data is encrypted as it traverses the computer networks.
Hannah, we actually had one more question come in about phone numbers. Is there a way to store the phone numbers of respondents on the responses sheet so that you can match those back?
Yeah, that's a great question. There absolutely is. And what you would do is you would make a key that was called numbers, and then in the value, it would be part of the widgets, and it would be, you would use a specific question, so inbound.0 or widgets.inbound.0.number, I think it is. So it should auto-complete for you, and that will just allow you to capture the participants' numbers. And then in the Google Sheet, I would just make sure you have a header that was called numbers that match that key value. And I think we do have an example of that in the documentation as well, because that can be definitely valuable.
Great. Thanks so much, Hannah. I think those are all of our questions right now. Actually, I just got one more I want to answer really briefly about verification to access WhatsApp Business API via Twilio. So there is a verification process. There are additional details online. You do need to complete this verification process before you can complete surveys on WhatsApp. It is possible to do this system that Hannah's demonstrated today on SMS before receiving that verification. So you can set it up and test it that way first. And then when you receive your WhatsApp verification, all of that content is transferable to sending it on WhatsApp. As Hannah demonstrated, you just change the way that phone numbers are formatted. Any other thing we need to know, Hannah, switching from SMS to WhatsApp?
No, I think you covered it. There's some breadcrumbs or some just some comments in the code that sort of specify exactly what pieces need to be updated.
Yeah, but that's a great way to kind of start designing perhaps before you have the verification for WhatsApp.
Absolutely.
So I'll move on here to some next steps. We're really pleased that you are all able to join us today for this workshop. Thank you again. If you are interested in building your own surveys, there are a couple of options that we just wanted to touch on briefly. In the demo today, Hannah shared kind of a basic survey, but many parts of that are customizable. One part is that you can design your survey to be invite only. So as Hannah showed, you include a list and you proactively send that survey out to a specific group of people. Or it could be considered an open survey. That's like the survey we had today for this workshop, where anyone who sent a message into our phone number could start the survey. You can choose what types of question formats will work for you. We found that multiple choice questions work well, where you respond with the number of your choice. Open-ended, you can do numerical validation inside of Twilio. Very complex multi-part questions will not be particularly well suited for WhatsApp surveys, but there are ways to format different question types. And then it's also your choice as the researcher to define what the accepted or not accepted responses will be. So just as you would use in a survey platform, you can design a logic block effectively that can accept specific responses, and that also offers an opportunity for branching throughout the survey if that is of interest. The delivery mode is flexible. As we were just discussing, we've designed this today in WhatsApp. You could also use the same Twilio infrastructure for SMS. We think that there's some real value to accessing particular populations and also continued cellular and Wi-Fi network accessibility to implementing this over WhatsApp. You can also choose to deliver this survey as text messages, as the one we demonstrated today. And Twilio does offer an interactive voice response setting. And so you can adjust this survey format to advance through IVR in case that will make the survey more accessible for your intended group. So these are just some of the ways that you can customize what we've demonstrated today. Certainly there's many more opportunities to build this out and customize it to your case. But we hope that some of these options will make it of interest and accessible to you in your context. We've referenced these resources today. I just want to make it really explicit what is going to be made available. On the website, we have created a technical documentation and how-to manual that goes stepwise through the parts that Hannah shared today. She was able to set it up for us in under an hour, and I think that's really exciting. It certainly took me a little bit longer than that the first time I set it up, but these stepwise guidance will help you walk through each of those parts. And as she mentioned, there are videos describing specific portions, especially going into greater detail on what those code snippets are, in case you're interested. We'll offer the recording of today's webinar as well as the recording of the one we hosted last week. And we'll be releasing an academic working paper on our first implementation of these WhatsApp surveys in 2 cases. We also really recommend that you reach out to the resources that Twilio has made available. They do document all of their own software and platforms online. And I want to call out specifically the Impact Access Core. So Twilio provides additional support for nonprofit organizations. This includes both reduced financing options for their software, as well as the ability to engage with volunteer software developers for support throughout the process. So we found that to be a really valuable resource as we've worked through this. And finally, we invite you to share with us the ways in which you are able to update and apply this work in your own projects and in your own context. Part of the excitement around this project is that it is a public resource, and so we look forward to seeing the ways in which others are able to implement and adapt WhatsApp surveys. So there's an opportunity to share those stories and build an implementation community if you wish to do so on our website. Before ending here, I'd like to just give another acknowledgement and thank you to our partners for these projects. We have been implementing WhatsApp surveys both with Lutheran Immigration Refugee Service and Mercy Corps, so we thank them for their partnership and collaboration in implementing this new survey method. We appreciate the support from Slalom. Hannah and her whole team there who supported us through the hackathon have been really critical in developing these resources that are accessible to even non-technical users. You know, I was not familiar with any of this as we started, and as Hannah demonstrated today, it's really accessible to those of us who are not software developers. And we appreciate funding from the Innovations for Poverty Action Peace and Recovery program for the application of this in Colombia. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate your engagement and hope that you found this informative. We look forward to seeing future opportunities of deploying WhatsApp surveys and hope that you will engage with us and share those stories with us. So thank you again, everyone, for attending, and hope that you have a great rest of your day.